Greetings friends. Thanks for stopping by for a visit. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe.
I've told parts of this story over the years, usually around a fire, usually after a couple drinks, usually with a joke at the end so it doesn't sit too heavy in the air. I've never told it straight through. Maybe because when you tell something straight through, you have to decide what you believe about it. This happened in 1998, back when Russia still felt unfinished. The Soviet Union had collapsed less than a decade earlier. Borders were looser. Permits were easier to get if you were willing to be patient and polite. We were in our late 20s and thought remoteness was the same thing as emptiness. We were wrong about that. The three of us flew into southern Siberia and made our way toward the eastern reaches of the Siberian Mountains, near the borderlands of Buryatia and Tuva. It wasn't Everest. It wasn't even particularly famous. That was the point. The Saiyans are wide-backed and quiet, long ridgelines, dark taiga forests of larch and pine, glacier-fed rivers that cut through valleys with no signage and no rescue infrastructure worth mentioning. Brown bears lived there. Wolves too. The kind of place where your map matters and your ego doesn't. Kevin came because he trusted me. We played high school football together, same defensive line, same bad knees now that we're older. He was steady, practical, strong in the way that doesn't advertise itself. If something broke, Kevin fixed it. Mike was different. Our families went to the same church. He'd known me since I was a kid. Thoughtful, patient, the kind of guy who bowed his head before meals even when no one asked him to. He wasn't mystical, but he respected things he didn't understand. We trained for avalanche terrain. We packed heavy canvas and aluminum. This was before satellite phones were common, before GPS units fit comfortably in a pocket. We carried paper topo maps, an analog compass, 2 short-range radios, and enough food to be self-contained. If something went wrong, it was on us. I remember standing at the tree line our first evening, looking up at the saddle we planned to cross. The wind was moving high above us, combing the ridges. The forest below was still. It felt untouched. That's the word I used at the time. Untouched. I don't use that word anymore. We made camp just below a high saddle on the third night out. It wasn't a dramatic spot. No jagged skyline, no cinematic cliff. Just a broad shoulder between 2 ridgelines in the eastern Siberian Mountains. The tree line had thinned into scattered larch. Their needles already turning that dull gold Siberian autumn gives you right before winter comes down hard. Patches of old snow clung to shaded pockets of rock. The ground was iron beneath the top inch of thaw. We chose the site carefully. The slope angle was moderate, not loaded. We checked for wind slab and obvious cornices higher up. Kevin stomped out the tent platform while Mike and I cut blocks for a low snow wall. The prevailing wind that afternoon had been steady from the west, predictable. We oriented the tent accordingly, staked it deep, double-checked the guy lines. By every measure we knew in 1998, it was a good camp. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how quiet it became. Not calm, quiet. The kind of quiet where you notice your own breathing as an intrusion. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sensation I couldn't name at first. It wasn't noise exactly. It was pressure. A low vibration that seemed to come through the ground rather than over it. I thought absurdly of distant artillery. The late 90s were full of rumors about leftover Soviet testing grounds. My mind went there before it went anywhere mystical. Then I realized the tent fabric was flexing inward in slow, rhythmic pulses. Not snapping in gusts, not rattling, pressing, like a hand testing the give of it. "Kev," I whispered. He was already awake, sitting up. "You feel that?" he said quietly. Mike stirred. "Wind." "That's not wind," Kevin replied. The sound outside didn't match what the tent was doing. Instead of a rushing roar, there was a kind of hollow tone, a low, steady hum that seemed to shift pitch every few seconds. The air felt wrong in my chest, tight, like I'd sprinted uphill. I felt it then, the urge. Came on without logic. A sudden, overwhelming need to get out of the tent. Not because it was collapsing, not because I heard anything approaching, just a conviction that staying inside was a mistake. Later in life, I read about infrasound, low-frequency vibration generated by wind moving over certain terrain. I read about how it can trigger panic, nausea, dread. Back then, all I knew was that my heart was racing and my hands were shaking for no identifiable reason. "I'm stepping out," I said. Kevin nodded immediately. No argument. We unzipped the door carefully. The cold hit like a slap, and the forest below us was completely still. Not a branch moving. Not a drift of snow crossing the ground. Above us, thin cloud cover hung low over the ridge. There was an orange glow to it, faint, unnatural looking. Not lightning, not aurora. More like reflected light from somewhere beyond the horizon. The kind you sometimes get with temperature inversions, when distant industrial light bends strangely in cold air. But there was nothing out there. No towns. No facilities for hundreds of miles. The pulsing continued for another 30 seconds, maybe a minute. It's hard to say. Time stretched in that cold. Then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The air settled into ordinary silence. The pressure in my chest eased like someone had opened a valve. Mike stepped out behind us, boots crunching lightly. He scanned the ridgeline, then the valley. "Do you hear it?" he asked. We didn't. He swallowed and nodded, as if confirming something to himself. Then he bowed his head briefly. Not dramatic, just a reflex. We stood there longer than necessary, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. When we crawled back into the tent, none of us said much. Kevin muttered something about mountain wind doing strange things in saddles. I agreed. That explanation was sufficient and available, which is usually all men in their 20s need. But I didn't sleep. I kept listening for the rhythm to return, for the fabric to press inward again. Didn't. At first light, Kevin was already packing. No discussion about staying another night. No debate about route adjustments. We broke camp efficiently and moved off the saddle before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge. As we descended toward thicker forest, I looked back once. The saddle looked harmless in daylight. Wind combed lightly across it now, ordinary and visible. If you'd walked up there at noon, you'd have seen nothing but rock, snow patches, and open sky. Kevin never brought it up again. Not on that trip. Not in the years after. Mike did one thing different, though. Before we left the saddle, he turned back briefly and said something under his breath. I couldn't hear the words. Prayer, maybe, or maybe just acknowledgement. At the time, I filed the whole night under environmental anomaly, the kind of story you tell later with a rational footnote attached. But here's the part one can't quite footnote. I've been in high wind before. I've been in storms that flatten tents. I've heard avalanches crack like rifle shots in the distance. This wasn't force. Felt like appraisal. Like the mountain ran its fingers along the walls of our little nylon shelter and decided, for reasons of its own, not to press harder. And that was the first time I understood that remoteness isn't the same thing as absence. We dropped from the saddle into thicker country the next day, into the taiga proper. The open slopes gave way to dense Siberian larch and pine, trunks straight and dark, spaced just wide enough that the forest never felt claustrophobic, just watchful. The ground was a mat of needles and frost. The air carried that resinous smell that seems older than people. By afternoon, we came across something that didn't appear on our map. It was a small wooden frame structure tucked just off a game trail. 4 posts, weathered gray with crossbeams lashed together. No walls, no roof. Ribbons were tied along the beams and nearby branches. Faded strips of blue, white, and yellow cloth. Some newer, some nearly dissolved into threads. We stood there a moment without speaking. I'd read enough before the trip to recognize it as a local offering site, the kind used in Buryat and Evenki regions, where travelers tie cloth to honor the spirit of a place or ask safe passage. Boundary markers. Places where the worlds overlap, if you believe that sort of thing. Kevin shrugged. Trail shrine. Mike stepped closer, studying the ribbons. You think people still come out this far? People have been out here longer than we have, I said. Mike reached out and flicked one of the ribbons lightly with his finger. Not disrespectful exactly, just curious. Careful, I told him. He smiled. You don't even believe in this stuff. No, I said, but it's not ours. He nodded and let his hand fall. We moved on. That night we camped lower, near a bend in a narrow river that cut through the forest like a seam. The trees grew close together there. The wind didn't reach the ground. Even in daylight, the air felt contained. I woke sometime in the dark to a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, not crashing, not stumbling, measured, slow. They circled the perimeter of the tent. Kevin shifted across from me. I could hear it in his breathing. He was awake too. You hear that? He whispered. Yes. The steps continued. Soft compression in frost. Pause. Then another. Too light for a bear. Too deliberate for falling branches. Wolves move differently, quicker, more fluid. This was upright pacing. Mike's voice came from the other side. It's just an animal. But he didn't sound convinced. The steps stopped directly behind my head. Then I heard something else. Breathing. Faint. Shallow. Except it wasn't right. The air was well below freezing. Every exhale should have been visible in the beam of a headlamp. Audible in rhythm. This was thinner than that. Almost like someone imitating breath. Kevin reached for the zipper. We both knew the risks of unsealing a tent at night in bear country. But something about the pacing felt patient. He unzipped it in one smooth motion and swung the flap aside. Our headlamps cut across the trees. Nothing. The frost outside the tent was unbroken. No paw prints. No boot marks. No drag. Just our own tracks from earlier already stiffening at the edges. We stood there longer than we should have. Light beams slicing between trunks. The forest gave nothing back. Back inside, no one said much. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day dragged us into uneasy sleep. Morning showed no sign of disturbance. The ground was clean. But later that afternoon, as we packed to move on, Kevin avoided eye contact. You heard her too, right? He asked quietly. Heard who? I said. He hesitated. His jaw tightened in a way I recognized from high school, the look he got before admitting something that felt weak. Doesn't matter, he muttered. He never elaborated. We hiked single file along the river, the trees thickening again as the valley narrowed. At one point I lagged behind to adjust a strap. The others rounded a bend ahead of me. That's when I saw her, or something shaped like her. Between two trunks, maybe 30 yards off the trail, stood a vertical pale form. Not luminous, not dramatic, just lighter than the bark around it. Human in proportion. Still, completely still. The forest was quiet enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I didn't feel the panic I'd felt on the saddle. This was different. Felt like being regarded. Not hunted. Not threatened. Assessed. The air hung heavy in my lungs. I watched for visible breath, some disturbance in the cold air around the shape. There was none. The form didn't sway with the trees. Didn't shift weight. Didn't advance. It simply occupied that space. My mind tried to resolve it into something ordinary. A birch trunk, light bark, shadow playing tricks. But birch bark doesn't hold posture. It doesn't align like shoulders. I blinked. It was gone. Not vanished in motion. Gone in absence. The space between the trunks was empty. I stood there longer than I care to admit before catching up with Kevin and Mike. Neither of them asked why I'd stopped. That night, Mike told us he dreamed of a woman standing at the edge of camp. She wasn't cold, he said quietly. No breath. Nothing. Kevin stared into the fire and said nothing at all. Years later, when I read about local stories, spirits that dwell at treelines, at river crossings, at the boundaries between terrains, I thought about the ribbons on that wooden frame. I thought about Mike touching one. I thought about how we'd walk through without offering anything in return. I don't think she followed us. I don't think she wanted to. I think we crossed something invisible and were noticed for it. And for reasons I still don't understand, we were permitted to leave. I've had almost 30 years to decide what I think happened out there. I don't believe we were hunted. I don't believe we were nearly killed. And I don't believe, at least not in the way horror stories frame it, that we were haunted. But I do believe landscapes carry memory. The Sayan Mountains aren't empty. They've held hunters, herders, shamans, soldiers, and wanderers long before 3 American boys decided to test themselves against them. There are ways of acknowledging a place that don't show up on maps. Kevin doesn't talk about that trip much. He still climbs, but he stays closer to home now. Mike never went back to Siberia. He says once was enough. As for me, I still dream about the Trilene sometimes. Not in fear. More like a memory that doesn't belong entirely to me. I don't think the mountains wanted to harm us. I think they wanted to know what kind of men we were, and whether we understood that we were visitors. Back then, we thought remoteness meant freedom. Now I think it means responsibility.
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more stories like these, please like and subscribe.